Repeat that, I dare you. Go on. Say it again, sweetheart. Nice and loud, so the whole squad gets to hear the lost tourist tell a Marine how to run his own lines. Corporal Jace Holloway stood with his boots planted in the churned mud of the patrol base and let his voice carry. Because a voice that carries is the cheapest kind of authority a man can buy. He was 22 years old. The chevrons on his collar were still new enough to catch the last of the light. Around him, the ground fell away into half-dug fighting holes and a low belt of concertina wire, and beyond the wire, the tree line stood black against a sky going the color of cold iron. It was the third night of the regimental field problem, and his fire team had spent most of it doing everything except the work. The woman he was talking to had walked in from the dark 10 minutes earlier, out of the direction of the northern draw, carrying a plain rucksack and wearing cammies with no rank on the collar, no name tape on the chest, and no unit patch on the shoulder. She had said 6 words to him, quietly, when she saw the gap in his perimeter. She had said, "Your northern sector is wide open." That was all. And Holloway, who did not like being corrected, and liked it less in front of his Marines, had decided the stranger would be the night's entertainment. She did not repeat it. She did not raise her voice to match his. She set the rucksack down on the flattest patch of ground she could find, squared it with 2 unhurried movements, and let her eyes move. First to the tree line, then to the near sentry post, then to the far one, then to the 200 meters of open ground that yawned between them. It was the look of someone taking an inventory of terrain. It was not the look of someone who was afraid. But Holloway had learned to read silence as fear, because in his short experience, the two had usually arrived together, and he had never once been made to pay for the assumption. Nothing to say now, he told his juniors, and grinned. Funny how that works. Big talk on the way in, quiet as a church once a Marine's in front of her. Behind him, Lance Corporal Devin Pyle shifted his weight and did not grin. Pyle was 21 and quieter than the rest, and something about the woman's stillness sat wrong with him in a way he could not have put into words. It was too complete. People who were merely lost fidgeted. People who were merely scared looked for the exits. This woman had looked for the exits once, found them, cataloged them, and then simply stopped, the way a light switches off. Maybe she's white cell, Pyle said. Maybe she's an evaluator. Maybe we just leave her be, Corporal. She's a role player who wandered off the opposing force lane, said Private First Class Sam Ostrander, 19 and eager to be liked, quick to laugh at whatever Holloway laughed at. Or a contractor who took a wrong turn at the entry point. Either way, she's not ours, and either way, she doesn't tell us how to run a perimeter. Either way, Holloway said, she's standing on my line telling me my business. He stepped in close and put a shoulder into her. Not hard enough to be a strike he would have to explain to anyone, just hard enough to rock her back a half step and make a point of it in front of the team. She caught her balance without a sound and without a stumble, from the hips, the way a person catches their balance on the deck of a boat, already expecting the ground to move under her before it did. 40 meters away, along the wire, a man who had spent 30 years learning to read Marines stopped walking. Sergeant Major Curtis Alden was 48 years old, the senior enlisted advisor of the regiment, and he had come out to walk the lines the way he walked them every field problem, unannounced, in the dark, alone, so that he could see the truth of a unit instead of the rehearsed version it prepared for visitors. He could not yet make out the woman's face at that distance. He could only see the way she stood, and the way her head moved when she read the ground, and the economy of that half step she had taken when the corporal shouldered her. He went very still. He had walked up on 1,000 patrol bases in his career, and he had learned that you could measure a unit in the first 10 seconds if you knew what to look at, and he was looking at something now that did not belong at the edge of a slack company's line. Holloway leaned in close enough that she could have counted his teeth. "Pick up your ruck," he said, "and get off my line before I have you walked off it by the guard." and the woman finally looked at him. Her expression did not change. It had not changed once since she arrived. She looked at him the way a person looks at weather, without judgment, without heat, simply registering the conditions. And she asked him a single quiet question. "Where does your final protective line tie in?" she said. "And which gun covers the draw to the north?" Holloway opened his mouth and discovered that he did not have the answer. He blustered, which is what men do when the ground under a question turns soft. He said the guns were sighted. He said his Marines knew their jobs. He said she could take her questions to somebody who cared about the opinion of a contractor. But he did not answer the question, because he could not. And everyone standing in that little circle of failing light understood that he could not. And the understanding cost him something he could not afford to lose in front of them. Ostrander, when the woman turned her calm gaze on him directly, found that he did not know which weapon covered the draw either, and looked at his boots. The woman did not press the advantage. That was the thing that unsettled them more than pressing would have. She simply stated, in the same even voice a person might use to read the data off a range card, that there were 200 meters of dead ground on their most likely avenue of approach, that no interlocking fires covered it, that the near sentry post could not see the far one, and the far one could not see the near one, and that a competent enemy would come exactly there, exactly tonight, in exactly this light, and would be inside the wire before the first Marine on the line got a weapon up. She said it without heat. Heat they could have answered with heat. The flat accuracy of it left them nothing to push against. She was not finished, though she took no pleasure in it. She asked them where the range cards were for the 2 crew-served positions, and when no one produced one, she noted that a position without a range card is a position that forgets its own sectors the moment the man who sighted it goes off shift. She asked which of them was the assistant gunner on the far post, and when a private raised a hesitant hand, she asked him for the maximum effective range of his weapon and the setting he would use for the draw, and the number he gave her was wrong by a factor that would have put his rounds 100 meters short of anything that mattered. She corrected him, not unkindly, in the flat register of a checklist, and told him the right figure, and told him to write it on the inside of his own forearm if that was the only place he would keep it. The private, to his credit, looked as though he intended to. It was the only useful thing anyone had told him all night, and it had come from the woman they were supposed to be laughing at. Near the comms hooch, under a cammy net strung low between 2 stunted trees, a junior Marine was fighting his way through a net call, stacking 15 words where 3 would do, stepping on his own transmission, forgetting the call signs. The woman, unasked, said quietly that the correct brevity was shorter and cleaner, and she gave it to him. 3 words, exact, in the proper form, the way it should have been sent. She did not do it to embarrass him. She did it the way a mechanic cannot help but hear a bad bearing 3 rooms away. Sergeant Major Alden, closer now, moving up the inside of the wire without hurry, heard the correction, and heard that it was correct, and the certainty in his chest grew another full inch. Holloway tried to take his footing back the only way he knew how, which was with volume. He ordered her again to leave his line. She did not leave. Unbothered, entirely unhurried, she asked him instead who his company commander was, and when the name Naylor landed, she filed it away behind her eyes, like a woman closing a drawer she intended to open again later. Alden, from the dark, almost stepped in then, and held himself back. A senior enlisted advisor does not walk into the middle of a scene he does not yet fully understand, and hand a young corporal the gift of an interruption to hide behind. He keyed nothing on the net. He watched, and he waited for the shape of the thing to finish forming, because he had a growing suspicion about the shape it was going to take, and he wanted the corporal to have every chance to stop before it did. And Corporal Jace Holloway, humiliated by a calm he could not crack and a question he could not answer, made the decision that would follow him for the rest of his career. He decided to make an example of the woman in front of everyone. He turned, and he called the other 2 fire teams over. They came because young Marines come when a confident voice calls them, and a loose circle formed in the mud under the last of the light. Holloway pulled out his phone, a contraband phone, forbidden in the field, the first of the night's small crimes now becoming a larger one, and held it up and branded her with the name he had chosen. "Everybody, meet the lost tourist," he said, and thumbed the camera on. The screen lit his face and the faces nearest him with a cold blue glow, and the woman observed, flatly, in the tone of a safety brief, that the light of his screen had just destroyed the night vision of every Marine in the circle and marked the position for anyone watching from the tree line. It was not a joke, it was a correction, and it was true, and 2 of the younger Marines instinctively turned their heads toward the black wall of trees before they remembered they were supposed to be laughing at her and not listening to her. The circle tightened anyway. Ostrander and a 3rd Marine drifted inward until she was hemmed against the concertina, close enough that the barbs caught at the fabric of her sleeve, and someone, no one would ever admit later whose boot it had been, hooked her rucksack and kicked it over into the mud. She let it happen. She kept her hands open and loose at her sides, and she moved only enough to keep her footing against the wire, and she did not lay a hand on anyone. Off to one side, a sentry turned his head at the noise, frowned, hesitated, and looked away, because it is a hard thing for a private to correct a corporal, and the Corps had not yet taught him that some things are worth being uncomfortable for. But a squad leader from another team, drawn out of the dark by the sound of a crowd where a crowd should not be, began to walk toward the circle with a crease deepening between his eyebrows, and Lance Corporal Devin Pyle stopped laughing. "Corporal," he said, "that's enough." Holloway rounded on him, and for one long moment the whole night balanced on the edge of Pyle's boots. He half-stepped forward, into the circle, into the exact space where a man decides whether he is going to be counted or not. And then he stopped. The moment held him, and he let it hold him, and he did not finish the step. He would remember that later. He would remember the precise width of the step he did not take for a very long time. The woman bent and lifted her rucksack out of the mud. She wiped the buckle clean with 2 fingers, unhurried, checked the strap, and re-squared the load on her back with the same 2 economical movements she had used to set it down. She had, while they laughed, memorized every collar and every face and every name they had called out to one another in the dark, the way a person memorizes the layout of a room they fully intend to return to. Some people mistake stillness for weakness. They are the ones who never see the ground tilt until they are already sliding down it. Stay with this one, because the ground is about to tilt, and it is going to tilt hard, and you are going to want to be watching when it does. If stories where the quiet one turns out to be the most dangerous person in the field are the reason you are here, subscribe, because that is the only kind of story this channel tells. Corporal Holloway, it turned out, wasn't finished with the woman, but he was, underneath the swagger, beginning to be afraid. It was the animal fear that arrives in a man when he has done something he cannot take back and does not yet know how large it is going to turn out to be. And frightened men reach for paper. He walked to the company command post tent and reported the woman as an unauthorized civilian loose on the exercise lanes. A security violation, he called it. A contractor refusing to leave, interfering with training, disrupting his fire team's rest plan. He did not mention the mud. He did not mention the phone, or the shoulder he had put into her, or the rucksack in the dirt. He told the version of the night in which she was the problem, and he was the solution. Because in that version, he was still a corporal doing his job, and not something else. Inside the tent, she stood off to the side while he talked, and she read the command post, the way she had read the perimeter, the map boards and what was and wasn't posted on them, the tracking charts 3 hours out of date, the way the radios were laid out on the field table and the way they were not, the sleeping bags where Marines were resting who should have been checking lines. It was a slack command post, and it told her a great deal about the company that ran it. None of it good. All of it now, hers to correct. Captain Reed Naylor, 29 years old, tired and short-tempered, and 3 days into a field problem that was going worse than he would ever admit aloud, did not come out from behind his map to look at her. He heard the words, civilian, and interfering, and he reached for the easiest answer available to a busy and overwhelmed man. Escort the contractor to the entry control point and off my lanes, he told the sergeant of the guard, without looking up, and logged the time. Note that she refused to leave when directed. He assumed she was a role player who had missed a safety brief and gotten turned around in the dark. He did not ask her name. He did not raise his eyes from the map board, and so he did not see the thing that Sergeant Major Alden had seen from 40 meters in the dark. A lance corporal from the guard reached out to take the woman by the arm. She let him guide her 2 steps toward the tent flap, and then she stopped, not pulling away, not resisting, simply becoming immovable, the way a mooring bollard is immovable, without effort and without drama. She told him in that same exact and unhurried voice that she would wait at the entry control point for the range control net to clear her through the exercise white cell, and that he should log that too. The precision of the request unsettled him more than a struggle ever could have. Civilians who wander off the lanes do not know what a white cell is, or how it clears people, or the flat institutional cadence of a person who has cleared several thousand of them across a career. At the flap of the tent, Sergeant Major Alden appeared. He said nothing at all about the woman. He looked at Captain Naylor, and he asked him one quiet question about the security posture of his patrol base, about the northern draw and the 200 meters of dead ground, and where exactly his final protective fires tied in along the western wall. Naylor, who had not personally walked his own lines since before dusk, did not have a good answer. He had an answer, but both men in the tent could hear that it was the answer of a commander describing a plan on paper, rather than a commander describing ground he had stood on with his own boots that night. The pressure in the tent shifted, subtly, the way weight shifts in a small boat when one man stands up. It began to rout away from the woman and toward the captain, and Alden led it, and said no more, and stepped back out into the dark. At the entry control point, under the red lens of a guard's flashlight, the woman let her face come fully into the light for the first time all night. And Sergeant Major Curtis Alden, arriving at the checkpoint a half step behind the escort, saw it and stopped breathing for the length of one long beat. He knew that face. He had known it across a decade, and across the worst ground either of them had ever stood on together, and even in the red light and the years he knew it instantly. He walked the last few meters slowly, deliberately, giving himself time to be certain and giving her time to see him coming, and he stopped at a respectful distance, and he said only one word. "Ma'am." She met his eyes, and something passed between the two of them that was far too large for the muddy little checkpoint it happened in. A whole decade of it, a whole war of it, a night neither of them talked about, all of it in a single second of held eye contact. And then she gave him the smallest possible motion of her head. A shake, no wider than a heartbeat. Not yet. 4 words she did not need to say aloud, delivered with a movement no one 3 feet away would have caught. Hold. Let it finish on its own. Alden had followed far harder orders than that one, in far worse places, from this same woman. He held. He turned to the sergeant of the guard and spoke low, so that only the two of them could hear it over the wind. "Whatever you think is happening here," he said, "you are wrong about who is standing at your entry control point tonight. Go and find your company commander, and you bring him here to me. Now." He did not explain. He had learned long ago that the truest and most important orders do not come with their reasons attached, that a reason is a thing you earn the right to withhold. The sergeant went quickly, because the tone left him no room at all to do anything else. Alden stood in the red light and let himself, for one moment, be certain of the size of the thing that was about to happen. He had served near this woman a decade ago, when she was a hard, quiet captain, and he was a gunnery sergeant, and he had watched her carry more than any officer he had known before or since, and he had watched her do it without ever once making the carrying somebody else's problem. He knew what she had done on a night 13 years gone that neither of them named. And he knew, standing there, that in a very few minutes, a whole company of young Marines was going to learn that the universe occasionally settles its accounts in person, and that the reckoning does not always look like thunder. Sometimes it looks like a tired woman in the mud with a rucksack, waiting, quietly, for the paperwork to catch up to the truth. Out on the line, Corporal Holloway was still riding the high of it, telling his juniors that he had gotten the tourist thrown off the lanes, that this was how you handled people who did not belong, that the Corps ran on Marines who knew how to hold a line and not on contractors who wandered in from the dark with opinions. Ostrander laughed and agreed. Pyle did not. Pyle stood a little apart from the rest and stared toward the entry control point, where the red light moved and stopped and moved again, and he felt the ground shifting under the night, the way a man feels a change in the weather in an old injury, hours before the sky gives any sign at all of what is coming. Alone at the checkpoint, the woman watched the exercise breathe in the dark around her. She watched the sentries, who did not rotate their scan at proper intervals, and the draw to the north that no gun in the company covered, and the slack in 100 small places that she could have named in her sleep. And she thought, without heat and without hurry, 3 full days ahead, to the morning she would stand in front of this entire regiment in the cold light and formally take command of it, and to all the work that this one muddy patrol base had just told her was waiting inside it. In a few minutes, the net was going to speak a billet aloud into the dark, and every Marine who had laughed tonight was going to learn all at once precisely what they had been laughing at. Before it does, subscribe so that you are here for the exact moment the arithmetic lands. This is not the kind of moment you want to hear about secondhand. She was Colonel Adriana Vega. She was 46 years old, and she had come up the hard way from the bottom. She had enlisted at 18 in the year 1998, an ordinary boot with nothing to recommend her but a refusal to quit, and she had commissioned 6 years later through a program reserved for prior enlisted Marines who had proven themselves in the ranks first, on the ground, before anyone handed them anything. She had spent the best and the worst years of her life in Marine Special Operations, and on her right forearm, kept covered tonight beneath a rolled and buttoned sleeve, was a Raider dagger inked in dark, clean lines, a thing that is earned and cannot be bought. The stillness that the fire team had read as fear was not fear. It had a source, and the source was a night 13 years gone that she did not talk about, to anyone, ever, and it went like this. In the year 2013, she had been 33 years old and a company commander at an isolated combat outpost, far past the last friendly line, and the enemy had come at night up an avenue of approach that was almost exactly like the draw she had flagged at Holloway's wire. The same dead ground, the same wrong and treacherous light, the same overconfident quiet before it. But she had sighted her guns before dark with her own 2 hands. She had walked her interlocking fires until she could see the cones of them with her eyes closed, until she knew where every weapon could reach, and, more importantly, where none of them could. When the outpost was hit, she did not raise her voice then, either. She read the ground in the flashes, and she held the line, and she moved her wounded to a casualty collection point that she ran herself, out in the open where a commander belongs when her Marines are the ones bleeding, counting them in and counting them out by name. The first probe had come at 0200, a handful of fighters testing the western wire, drawing fire, mapping her positions in the muzzle flashes the way she was mapping theirs. She had held most of her guns silent through it, refusing the bait, letting only the one weapon that had to answer do the answering, because a commander who shows all her cards to a probe has nothing left when the real assault comes. It came 40 minutes later, up the dead ground to the east, exactly where the terrain said it would. A full push against the weakest seam in the outpost's line. She had known it would come there. She had war-gamed it there. And still, it was very nearly enough. She had moved along the inside of the wall in the dark, with her radio pressed to her ear, shifting fires, feeding ammunition forward, pulling one squad off a quiet sector to reinforce a loud one, doing the cold arithmetic of a defense in her head, while the world came apart around her at a range of 30 meters. She did not raise her voice. She had learned by then that a commander's calm is a physical resource the same as ammunition, that Marines spend it and steady themselves on it, and that the fastest way to lose a line at night is for the men holding it to hear fear in the voice on the net. So she gave them numbers and directions and the flat certainty of someone who had already decided they were going to hold, and slowly, position by position, they held. Sergeant Nolan Frey had held a collapsing position on the eastern wall so that the rest of the element could consolidate and the wounded could be carried back across the open ground. He held it longer than any man could reasonably have been asked to hold it. He held it until the line behind him was solid and the last of the casualties was moving, and then the night took him and did not give him back. Colonel Vega, Captain Vega then, had run the recovery herself in the last hour before dawn, and she had carried what there was to carry, and she had not spoken about the weight of it since to a single living soul. She did not talk about that night, but she carried it every day, folded small and kept close, the way a person keeps a set of dog tags in a breast pocket over the heart, where they rest against you and remind you with every step exactly what the cost of the work has been. That was what the fire team had read as fear. It was the stillness of a woman who had stood on ground infinitely worse than a muddy training area patrol base, and who had not moved, because moving was not what that moment had required of her, and neither was fear. She rolled her cuff down over the dagger on her forearm, squared her shoulders once, and keyed nothing on the net. 3 days early or not, orders read aloud yet or not, this was already her regiment, and every slack sentry and every yard of uncovered dead ground and every filmed act of cruelty she had witnessed tonight was already hers to fix. The net crackled to life. A voice from the exercise white cell asked the company command post to confirm the location of the incoming regimental commander for a scheduled link-up. Time now. Corporal Holloway heard, through the fast grapevine of a patrol base, where every rumor travels the wire in minutes, that the tourist was being processed off the lanes at the entry control point, and he found that he could not leave it alone. He swaggered over to take the last word for himself and to get one more clip for his phone while he still could. "Smile for the squad, tourist," he said, thumbing the camera back on. "This one's going straight in the group chat. You're gonna be famous." He reached out and yanked the strap of her rucksack off her shoulder, spilling it into the dirt for the second time that night. A second witnessed, deliberate, physical act, and this time it happened directly in front of the sergeant of the guard and in front of Sergeant Major Alden, who had come back to the checkpoint and stood watching with his hands loose at his sides and his weathered face set like carved stone. She let the ruck fall. She did not touch Holloway. She did not need to touch him. She looked at him, and for the first time in the whole long night, Colonel Adriana Vega smiled. It was small, and even, and final, the smile of a person who has already won the thing completely and is simply waiting, without cruelty and without haste, for the other party to be informed of the result. "Careful, Corporal," she said. "The camera's still running." He mistook it for a bluff. He would spend a long time afterward understanding how completely he had misread that smile, and how much it had been trying, in its quiet way, to warn him. "Corporal." Alden's voice came across the checkpoint like a blade laid flat on a table, quiet, unhurried, and utterly impossible to argue with. "Hands off. Step back, and stand fast." There were 30 years of the Marine Corps in those 6 words, and even Holloway, who did not yet understand anything at all about the night he was standing in, understood that much. He stepped back. Headlights swept across the entry control point. A pair of tactical vehicles rolled in out of the dark and stopped, the assumption of command party, arriving for the scheduled link-up. And the range control net spoke again, flat and loud on the guard's handset speaker. And it did not speak a name. It spoke a billet. "White Cell, this is Control. Confirm link-up. Incoming regimental commander, Colonel Vega, at the company entry control point. Time now." The word colonel hung in the wet night air like something solid enough to touch. Sergeant Major Curtis Alden came to attention. He did not call a formation. He did not order anyone to salute. He simply squared his body and his boots and faced the woman in the unmarked cammies, with the rucksack in the mud at her feet. The only man on that entire patrol base who had known the truth for the last 20 minutes and had held it. And he addressed her by her rank, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to, and no farther. "Colonel Vega," he said, "the regiment's been waiting on you, ma'am." One Marine, rigid, certain, and correct. That was all it was. That was all it needed to be. Corporal Holloway's face began to move. First came confusion. The tourist and a colonel. 2 words that refused to occupy the same person, no matter how he turned them. Then came disbelief, as the night started to replay itself behind his eyes at speed. The phone, the mud, the shoulder he had driven into her, the rucksack kicked into the dirt twice, the camera. Then came recognition, arriving all at once and from every direction at the same time. The collar he had mocked for being empty of rank, the sector of fire she had read cold in the dark, the question about the final protective line that he had not been able to answer in front of his own Marines. And then, last of all, came horror, pure and total and complete. While he stood there in the headlights, still holding the contraband phone in his hand, like the piece of evidence it had become. Behind him, the whole squad froze where they stood. Not at an order. Not at a salute. There was no formation and no ceremony, and no command to freeze them into place. They froze at the arithmetic finally landing, at the slow, terrible understanding spreading from Marine to Marine in the dark that they had spent the better part of an hour mocking, filming, hemming in, and shoving the woman who now owned, without exaggeration, every single day of the rest of their careers. Private First Class Ostrander felt it hit him like cold water down the back of the neck. He had laughed the loudest. He had kicked the ruck, or had been close enough to it that it made no difference, and now he stood with his hands hanging useless at his sides, replaying every word he had said, understanding that each one of them had been recorded somewhere far more permanent than a phone. In the memory of a colonel who forgot nothing, and in the memory of the sergeant major standing at attention beside her. He wanted, more than he had ever wanted anything, to become invisible. He could not. That was the beginning of the only useful lesson the night had for him. And Lance Corporal Devon Pyle, standing a little apart from the rest, as he had stood apart all night, felt something entirely different move through him. Not relief, exactly, and not vindication, because he had earned neither. He had said the words, and then swallowed the step, and he knew it. And he understood in that frozen moment that being almost right is its own particular kind of failure. He looked at the woman he had wondered about, the one whose stillness had sat so wrong with him, and he understood that his instinct had been correct and his courage had been late, and he made himself a quiet promise there in the mud that he would not be late again. It was the most important thing that happened to him in 4 years of service, and it happened in total silence, and no one but him ever knew the exact moment it occurred. Captain Reed Naylor arrived at a dead run, summoned by his sergeant of the guard, and slid to a stop at the very edge of the light. He saw his own sergeant major standing at rigid attention in front of an unbadged woman with a rucksack in the mud at her boots, and he understood, all at once and all the way down to the bottom of himself, exactly what his own slack had produced on his own lines, on his own watch. He straightened. He did not speak. There was nothing yet that could be said. Colonel Vega bent, picked her own rucksack up out of the dirt, and settled it onto her shoulder for the third and final time that night. "Captain," she said, evenly, without a trace of heat, "I want you, the sergeant major, and Corporal Holloway, by name, at your command post in 5 minutes." Then she turned and walked toward the tent, and the assumption of command party fell in behind her, and the whole exercise seemed to hold its breath. What happened at the command post was not a spectacle, and that was the entire point of it. There was no shouting, there were no handcuffs, there would be no court-martial, and no investigation convened to make a public show of the thing. Colonel Adriana Vega had spent far too many years watching what real consequence looked like to ever confuse it with theater. Theater was for people who needed an audience to feel that justice had happened. She did not. She had Corporal Holloway open his phone in front of her and delete the footage he had taken, every single clip of it, one at a time, while she watched him do it. And then she had him hand the contraband device to the sergeant major, where it would stay. She relieved him as fire team leader, effective that moment, in a voice no louder than the one she had used to correct his junior's net brevity an hour before. And then she did the harder thing, the thing that was mercy and weight at the same time, which is the only kind of mercy that changes a man. She did not throw him away. She directed his reassignment to a billet where he would be led hard every day by senior Marines who now knew in exact detail what he had done, and where he would be given the long, uncomfortable, unglamorous chance to become the kind of Marine he had proven tonight that he was not yet. Not cuffs, something far heavier than cuffs. He would have to stay and dig and earn it all back one day at a time in front of everyone who had watched him lose it. She turned then to Captain Naylor, and the lesson she gave him was cold and precise and delivered in private, which made it land harder than any dressing down in front of the troops ever could have. A patrol base with 200 meters of uncovered dead ground and no interlocking fires on its most likely avenue of approach, she told him. A fire team that films a hazing in the dark instead of digging its fighting holes is a company commander's failure long before it is ever a corporal's. A slack line does not simply happen to a good officer overnight, she said. It is built, patiently, one uncorrected small thing at a time, by an officer who stopped walking his own perimeter with his own boots and started trusting the version of it that lived on his map board. She gave him 30 days and her personal attention. Not a relief, a correction, which is the thing a leader gives a subordinate she has decided not to give up on. His company would be watched, closely, and helped, and held to a standard all at once. He understood that he had just been handed a second chance he had not earned, and that he would now have to spend the next 30 days earning it in retrospect. She said one more thing to him before she let him go, and it was the thing he would remember longest. She told him that she had noticed his patrol base long before Corporal Holloway ever opened his mouth, that she had walked in from the northern draw specifically, on purpose, because from the map it was the obvious avenue of approach, and she had wanted to see whether his company had covered it or ignored it. They had ignored it. A commander who had wanted to embarrass him could have written all of that into a report and ended his career over it before breakfast. She was not going to do that. She was going to give him the chance to fix it, and she was going to make certain he understood that the chance itself was the discipline. Mercy, she told him, is not the absence of a standard. Mercy is a standard you are trusted to go and meet. Corporal Holloway, for his part, would learn over the following weeks exactly how heavy a light sentence can be. There was no story to tell in the barracks, no dramatic arrest to make him briefly infamous, no court date to build a grievance around. There was only the quiet fact of a corporal who had been a fire team leader and was one no longer, folded back into the ranks under Marines who had watched the whole thing happen and would neither forget it nor mention it, which was worse. He would have to become someone the squad could respect, again from the bottom up, in full view, with no shortcut available to him. Some nights, he would have preferred the handcuffs. The colonel had known that when she chose. That, too, was the point. And then she called Lance Corporal Devon Pyle aside, out of the light, away from the others. And she told him quietly that she had seen him. She had heard him say, "Corporal, that's enough," when no one else on that line would say it. And she had seen him half step forward into the circle, and she had seen him stop. "You had the right instinct tonight," she said, "and not yet the spine to finish it. Hear me clearly. That is not a character flaw, Lance Corporal. That is a thing we build in a Marine, deliberately, over time, the same as we build everything else. But you do not ever wait that long again. The next time you know in your gut that a thing is wrong, you are already moving toward it before you have finished the thought. Do you understand me?" She promised him nothing but the chance to be better, and she named him for nothing and made him no guarantees. And that restraint was the largest gift she had given anyone all night. If this is the kind of justice you came here for, the quiet, exact kind, the kind that costs the guilty something real and hands the almost good a way forward instead of a rope, then subscribe to Honor Tales, because there is always another story like this one coming. Before dawn, the exercise breathed on in the growing gray light, the way an exercise always does, indifferent to the small human weather that had moved through it in the dark. The fighting holes got deeper, the northern draw got a gun and a second gun, and interlocking fires that finally tied the two sentry posts together across the open ground. And Colonel Adriana Vega stood alone beside a cold, half-finished fighting hole, with the sky going pale at its eastern edges, and squared her own rucksack one more time, out of pure habit, because a commander carries her own load, and always has. She rolled her cuff back, and she looked, for one long moment, at the Raider dagger inked on her forearm. Dark, clean lines, earned on ground she did not talk about. And she thought of Sergeant Nolan Frey, the man who had held the collapsing wall so that everyone behind him could live to grow older, and be foolish, and be mocked, and be forgiven, and be made into something better on muddy training fields years and years down the line. She rolled the cuff back down over the ink. "Still carrying it," she murmured. "To no one. To him." Then she shouldered her load, and turned and walked toward the command post to begin the real work of a regiment that was hers now, 3 days early. Mud and slack and second chances and all. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart, Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.